Thank you, Lily. It's very kind of you. And yes, indeed, it's almost a little sad to be here for the last time, at least for the voyage I'm participating in. And several people are staying on for the Caribbean part of the continued journey of the vessel. And some people asked me also about how bad can volcanoes really be. So I decided to give you a little lecture today on a Caribbean volcano and on a really bad disaster. Of course, disasters in volcanology are always opportunities as well, opportunities to learn, to improve things, to make things better. And I'm going to talk about that as well. But it's the analysis of these not so super good events that really brings us further. And I'd like to talk about the Pelée Eruption of 1902. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out it's the 120-year anniversary this year, which makes it particularly timely to talk about this event. So this is an image here of the event. And as I'll try to convince you later, the image is entirely wrong. This is not how the event looked like at all, and I'll get back to this. This is from a Czech newspaper. You can just about read it here. And this was published just after the event, but this was prior to the times of modern media and quick transmission, and this was an artist's impression of what could have happened. And I'll tell you a little later how this artist's impression shows us how the perception of events was fundamentally different to what really happened. And this was one of the reasons for the cause of this disaster. So I'll take you to the Lesser Antilles, and there's an island string here in the Western Atlantic. And here in the little kind of simple map here, we have a string of volcanoes, and this is what we call an island arc, because they're arranged in an arc-like shape. And there we have a suite of volcanoes, and Martinique, the island of Martinique, lies here, with Pelée here in the northern part of it. There is active volcanoes there, and they're owned by different nations. And there is, for example, the Soufriere volcano, Saint Vincent. There's Saint Lucia, and then there is, of course, Guadeloupe and La Soufriere volcano. And there has been continuous activity here, Montserrat, for example, in some of these islands, and this is, of course, a threat to the present day. Now, focusing in on Martinique, here we have the island of Martinique, and there is a lumpy part with hills up here in the north and a shallower part here in the south. And, well, as you guess, the volcano sits right here in the north. And here's the city of Saint-Pierre, and this is Pelée, Montpellier. And the current capital of the island is Fort-de-France, here in the center of the island. Previously, it actually was Saint-Pierre, but after the catastrophe, this changed. And here is an image. This is Montpellier in all its might, sitting above the town of Saint-Pierre. And it's very scenic, it's very pretty there. It's got green hills and fresh water running down from the hills, lovely beaches. So I could see why it's very attractive to settle there. So here's just another impression of the same. And the green hillside here, it gives away that there's a lot of agriculture going on. It's tropical, and together, well, with the water availability, the warm climate, and the rich volcanic soil, this makes for a beautiful agricultural hub in this part of the island. And here's just an impression of the beach. And this, strangely enough, was my field accommodation when I was there a few years ago. This was as part of the 100-year anniversary of the event. I got a young European Union researcher grant, and there was a workshop hosted at this particularly nice place. Otherwise, I couldn't have afforded it. And so I stayed there with a lot of big volcanologists at the time, and I learned a lot at the time when I had the opportunity to visit. So, but here's a few images from the old days, from well over 100 years ago, and this is from prior to the eruption, this image up here, and you see the town of Saint-Pierre here and the volcano up there, and this is an aerial photograph of how the volcano looks today. And this is actually the 1902 dome, or the remnant of it, and this is the dome of 1928. What do I mean when I say dome? Well, these volcanoes in this part of the world, they have a magma type that's very sticky. It's different to the magma type in the Canary Islands. And this sticky material is often andesitic, as we call it. That's the technical name for it. And this sticky magma, it comes out sometimes like toothpaste. If you squeeze your toothpaste, then there's a little bit of material coming out. And then at some point it tilts over, it flips over, and it falls down. But the first bit, when it's kind of stiff enough to withstand gravity, that's what a dome would be like, a lava dome. It's when material is kind of fluid, but not fluid enough to really run down the hill. And this is a very dangerous situation in volcano terms. But let me give you a little introduction on Saint-Pierre. And around 1900, Saint-Pierre was the colonial capital of Martinique. It was widely referred to as the Pearl of the Lesser Antilles. It was founded 1635. The city was located only 6 kilometers from the peak of Mont Pelée, and several rivers came down from Pelée, supplying the town with fresh water. And this was, of course, one of the reasons why the settlement was formed there. So here's a little map, and this dark outline here is actually the area of destruction that the volcano caused in 1902. And here is the city of Saint-Pierre, and as you see, several rivers come down from the hillside, making this a very attractive area with a sheltered bay for a harbor and with enough water and green hills to supply the city with everything it needed. Later, I'll talk about this village here, the village of Montrouge, and the dashed line here is from later in the 1902 events. There was a second and a third eruption, and this was in August of that year, and their other parts got also devastated, and this village here will come back, so I'll mention it later, just for your reference. It sits off the damage zone of the May events of that year. So, Saint-Pierre had an official population of about 19,700 in 1894, and in 1901 it had 26,000. So it was growing at the time. It was a thriving place, and a small French elite, remember it was colonial days, a small French elite formed the ruling class there. The city had a cathedral, a hospital, a theater, and many imposing public buildings. Here's a photograph of the theater. You can just read here, the theater, and we'll look at the ruins of this a little later. And there's actually a statue of one of the famous people coming from the area there, and this is to Josephine, the first wife of the Emperor Napoleon. She came from that part of the world. In 1895, Saint-Pierre had electric lighting. This is just 2 years after the city of Glasgow, can you imagine? So this was not a backwater. This was really a very lively place. The main street was Rue Victor Hugo, and here's an artist's impression of it. And I point out, see, there is canalization here. So this was all quite refined, and this is a photograph of reality. So of course the artist's impression is always nicer. But here you can see the same. Again, here was the main street, and there was water kind of channels here to ensure that everything was hygienic, at least by the standards of the time. So here's a few more impressions of the city prior to the 1902 catastrophe. And this was the mayor's house. These steps, they led up to the mayor's house. And I also tried to find a few images, not just from the central part of the city, but also from the suburbs. And here's various impressions I found. So here you see local women doing the laundry in one of the rivers that comes down. Here is another photograph of one of the rivers coming down from the hills. Here is one of the harbors with some fishing boats. So altogether, as far as I can tell, quite a scenic place and quite a lovely place to be. It was also a major trading port, and there is the main street, Rue Victor Hugo, and here you see several vessels out there. And there was, during the catastrophe, vessels from basically all over the globe. There was US vessels, there was European ones, and there was a Danish one, for instance, and French ones, of course. So, well, many of these vessels came to pick up goods, and there was two main goods that were of, well, interest here, and that was bananas and rum. And of course, a lot of rum was traded here in Saint-Pierre at the time. But you see, this was quite a lively place, not just from the population side, but also there was a lot of traffic there and a lot of trade with the international world. And as I said, sugarcane and rum was, of course, one of the main things. And here you see the barrels of rum being ready to be loaded up on the ships. And as we learned on Madeira, some rum is better than other rum. And here, when you spell it with an H on Martinique, it means it's the particularly strong rum. And this one here is made from the sugarcane itself, and it's not just from the leftovers of the sugarcane. And that means it's very, very strong, 55 to 60 volume% of alcohol. And that will become relevant later on, because volcanoes and rum is not a good combination. So this is a bottle I purchased at the time, and it's, of course, empty by now. But the bottle is still, well, it's still on my mantelpiece because I like it so much. And this is one of the strong variety, and I thought it was very, very pleasant, and I keep it as a souvenir, reminding me that I have to go back someday. So, prior to the events of 1902, I should point out that there was actually volcanic activity. There was volcanic activity in 1851 and in 1792, but each time only with minor fumarole activity. Fumaroles are gas venting sites where sulfurous gases are coming out, and that doesn't mean any major explosion or lava, it's just venting. And this was described from these 2 years here. So it, however, means there's something hot underneath inside the volcano. There was also some harmless ashfall events. They seem to have been short-lived in those years. So there wasn't a huge indication, at least in public perception, that the volcano was particularly dangerous. Knowledge existed about a major eruption in 1635, which people were told, the French elite was told by some of the local people that lived there, obviously for many generations. But it wasn't taken overly seriously. And today we would probably react with suspicion to this. If somebody tells you there is dangers here, even if it's just a legend, even if it sounds a bit colorful, you should pay attention usually when it's to do with volcanoes. So the 1902 event actually started quite a bit beforehand, and this is also noteworthy because volcanoes don't just wake up. They have a lead-in time. It can be weeks, it can be months, it can be years. Many volcanoes take years to do that, and I'll talk about this a little more later on as well. So the first kind of increased gas venting or fumarole activity was noted as early as 1889. So quite a bit before, well over 10 years before. Then in the 10 years leading up to the turn of the century here, the fumaroles changed location, but it seems to the local population that the activity is not increasing. In 1900, there's reports about damaged vegetation in the summit area of the volcano. Today, we would get very alert about these things, but back then, it didn't seem to ring a bell to anyone. In 1901, new vents seem to open and sulfurous gas is emitted, and there is reports of unpleasant smells in the villages around the volcano. And then in the early month of 1902, sulfurous smells are increasing, and they're actually noted in the city itself. In April 22nd, submarine telegraph cables from Martinique to Guadeloupe break. And nowadays we have a better idea that this has to do with either earthquakes or submarine landslides or so things like that, which tell us something about activity levels of a volcano. But back then, again, it didn't cause any alert. It was just something that happened, and people didn't necessarily see connections between these events. So April 23rd, seismic shocks are first felt around Montpellier, and that means earthquakes, and dishes are thrown from the shelves, is the report. We now believe that these shocks were caused by initial phreatomagmatic reactions. There was a little crater lake in the volcano. When magma rises up, it starts to cook up the water, and this would cause some steam explosion. Well, at this point, an investigation party is put together, and they climb the volcano summit, and they report that there is water fountains, little geysers, and that there is a crater area and a little lake and all that kind of thing, and that a new dome has started to grow within the lake. We would be extremely alert about these things today, but there is no major action taken as a consequence of this report, which is a bit puzzling from a present-day perspective. Now, May 1st, and we're getting close to the disaster. The rumbling of the volcano increases dramatically, and the air becomes very sulfurous. 1,600 people have left the town at this stage. However, 9,000 people from the surrounding villages have flocked to the city. They had no other place to go. They were seeking refuge there. This caused a swell of the population to 28,000. Frequent loud explosions are then reported from May 2nd, and then horses are reported to collapse from suffocation at that point. And this is a report actually from the wife of the American ambassador in Saint-Pierre, and she writes in her diary that this is getting very intense now. Horses are collapsing in the streets, and the volcano is glowing during the nights. As you can work out today, we would start getting ready to evacuate the city and make all sorts of emergency plans. But nothing was done, and I'll tell you there was another reason for that, but this is a photo of the refugees coming to town, and you see it was quite packed in several places of the city. So here's the reason that many believe was instrumental, and that is a secret order from Paris is received that the city is not to be evacuated. The reason for that is there was an election coming up a few days later. And there was concern that some liberal candidate who had native roots, he was doing well in the kind of polls, and there was concern that he might be elected. So they wanted the conservative French elite to stay in the city. And the problem was the governor himself, however, had already left. And this was a bit of a concern. So he was told to go back, can you believe it? And the official reports of the investigation party are then published a few days after they were up there. And they conclude, based on this secret order, Montpellier is no greater threat to Saint-Pierre than Vesuvius is to Naples. Yes, I agree. They, however, completely ignored the 79 AD Pompeii disaster. So, in a way, this comparison was entirely correct, therefore, but slightly inappropriate nevertheless. So, reference is made to harmless Vesuvius eruptions, but not to the AD 79 one. So, it was a bit misleading. Today, we wouldn't be very impressed with that. So, morning, May 4th, plume ascends, accompanied by loud rumbling. Tremors are continuous, and the plume, the ash plume, reaches 9,000 meters. May 5th, lahars, this is mud flows, spill over the crater, and the first people die. 23 people are killed. May 6th, activity shifts to material being thrown out, ballistic transport of material, and that tells us it's getting quite serious. This is a time where you should not even be anywhere close to this volcano, and the dome seems to grow as well. The eruption frequency increases steadily on May 7th and is now continuous. The investigation party comes back and says the phenomena are not abnormal. Instead, they're identical to Vesuvius phenomena. And of course, they were right in this. But they were, trying to calm people down. May 7th, the governor and his family have to make a point based on the secret order from Paris, and they return to the city. So just when the first minor pyroclastic flows start to come from the summit, pyroclastic flows are glowing avalanches. And this was exactly what nobody expected. People at that point had no idea. They thought volcanoes make ash and lava, glowing avalanches, nuées ardentes, as the French call it. They were not something that was in the perception of people at the time. So this is one of the very last photos in the days prior to the eruption. You see the volcano has gas coming out. You can barely see things here in this part of the photograph. Some of the ships have left already, being smart enough. But, well, the people were actually encouraged to stay, as I say, instead of encouraged to leave, which would be the right thing to do. May 8th, it was a holiday. During the night at 3 a.m., a big pyroclastic flow came down the other side of the volcano, killed 400 people, but the people in Saint-Pierre had no idea about this. We had no telephones back then or the internet, so this was completely unknown. 6 a.m., the ash is causing total darkness. The sun did not rise. At 8 a.m., the Saint-Pierre telegraph station signals to Fort-de-France that they're open for business today. But at 8:02, they're disconnected. And that's how we know that at 8:02 something really bad happened. And this is a major pyroclastic flow where nuées ardentes was rushing down the hill at enormous speed and rushing through the city of Saint-Pierre. This was a phenomenon that is similar to that of Pompeii, but had been completely forgotten since then, and people had no idea of this type of thing being a possibility. There is some eyewitness reports from further afield, and they report a massive, dark, very dense cloud spilling over the crater and moving at enormous speed towards Saint-Pierre. So it's not something that went up and collapsed, as we believe to be the case at Pompeii. It was something that was really going directly at the city. It was a blast. And this made it particularly problematic. The initial cloud shoots over the crater and reduces downhill in speed a little bit, but it's still very, very fast when it reaches the town. This is symptomatic of a blast eruption, as we call it today, or, as it's known in volcanology, a Pelean-type eruption. It really gave rise to the concept of an eruption type. Flow velocities are initially up to 180 meters per second. I translate that. That is 650 kilometers per hour. There's no Formula One car that will get you away from this. None. It's still up to 500 kilometers per hour when it hits the city. So there is no escape if you're in the way of this. Temperature estimates are very, very difficult because the debris continued to burn, but reasonable estimates are between 250 and 400 degrees. So a hot, up to 400 degree gas cloud is rushing through the city at 500 kilometers per hour. Well, the rescue team from Fort-de-France arrives at lunchtime of that day. They realize something was utterly wrong after the telegraph cables had been disconnected. But they just see a blaze, and it's so hot they cannot actually enter the city. It takes them until 3 o'clock this afternoon, and then they are going into the city in the outskirts, and they find all but one person dead. And this is from this Czech newspaper again. I mentioned it at the very beginning. Here's the rescue team coming on shore, and here's the city ablaze, and here's the volcano towering over the city, and the people are all effectively dead. So this has been really puzzling, and here we have this illustration showing lava flows coming down the hill, and this of course was entirely wrong. It reflects that the knowledge at the time was very limited about these phenomena, and what really happened was a super fast pyroclastic flow. This is the most dangerous thing a volcano can do, and not a lava flow as we would assume to be, for example, at Mount Etna. That's how an Etna eruption looks, and this is what people in Europe were familiar with, not the pyroclastic flows that you see in the Lesser Antilles and in Indonesia and in the Philippines, etc. So here's a few impressions of the aftermath, and here you see the volcano. Some of the photos are not the best. I mean, they're over 100 years old. So here you see the cloud and the fumes coming out, and this is how the city looked afterwards. Here's a few redrawn newspaper photographs, and from different nationalities. And this is the Czech one again, and this is a British one. And here, the devastation, it just reads here in the headline. And here's a French inspector walking towards the city just as a scale, and you see the trees are, well, there's not a lot left here. And this is a very famous photograph. This is the volcano here, and this is Rue Victor Hugo again, the main street, and not a single roof is left on any of the houses. So this was one of the very prosperous suburbs, Fondscore, and this is where the rich people lived, and this is how it looked prior to the eruption. This is how it looked after the eruption. It was gone. It was literally pushed into the sea. So destruction from the blast is extensive in the outskirts, and it decreases towards the sea. The blast damages most of the rum distilleries up the slopes, and tens of thousands of liters of rum flow towards the city. Remember, the rum is very alcohol-rich, and rivers of burning rum are reported, and this added to the disaster. So not only was the volcano a problem, but also the fires continued because of the rum being added to the problem. The casualties have severe skin burns, but strangely enough, many of them have intact clothing. The French military doctor concludes that the ash cloud was so fast that it was not able to ignite the fabric. But of course, you would suffer the damage from 400 degrees and hot ash particles everywhere, including your lungs. So the members of the rescue team closes the report with, "No living soul appears in this desert of desolation, encompassed by appalling silence." So here's a few photographs, and here you see one of the casualties, and this photo is very, very kind of important in volcanology. It is shown to every student. It's very sad, but it's very instructive at the same time. Here's a mother and several infants here. They still have the clothing on. The clothing has not burned. So this is the evidence for this statement I said. And here's one of the medical staff from the French rescue teams. And you still see the bottles on the table. They have not been thrown over. So the reality or the realization is that something hot and a gaseous kind of phase must have penetrated everything in there. Not the pressure wave, it was the hot gases that were the problem, and people would die from that, even though the fabric is not ignited and the bottles are still on the shelves. So the heat was so enormous that there's a lot of finds there. This is from a metalware shop. This was a box, probably a cardboard box or a wooden box with scissors, and the heat was so intense it's welded together. This was a box of nails, and here you see glass. To melt glass, you need really intense temperatures, and you see the glass and the wine bottle here being deformed from the heat. The porcelain is baked together. And that implies temperatures well above 1,000 degrees Celsius, so super hot. And in the harbor, well, you can still see some of the sunken ships there today. It's a big tourist attraction. If you're a diver, that's where you go, and people find all sorts of things. Here's some ship bells. This one from 1862, and obviously, well, it only made it till 1902, so this ship sank after 40 years in the volcanic eruption. I want to talk a little bit about this gentleman here. He is that sole survivor. I tried to find out a little more. He was a bit of a lad, I guess you would say, and he was in prison because he was implicated to be part of some kind of theft, and he was then sent downtown for civic duty. He was supposed to clean up somewhere, but he snuck away and got drunk. And when that happened, he was picked up by some guard, and then they got into a fight, and well, it's not quite clear what happened, but he assaulted an officer effectively, and he was put into isolation, imprisonment, and it was this little cabin he was in, or this little stone cabin, and it had only one tiny window for ventilation. So he was put in that cell here, in that isolation cell, and that was the reason for his survival. So, strangely enough, he survived, but he had severe skin burns because this little window still allowed the hot gas and ash to come in. And after a month of recovery, he was actually rehabilitated because, well, he didn't look very healthy afterwards, I think. He went to the US and he became a circus star as the man who could withstand the volcano. Apparently, he still died poor, so he probably didn't mend his ways in the end, but he was the sole survivor. What an intriguing story, I thought. So, a few words about the theater. This was the theater prior to the eruption, and the volcano is behind, or was behind the theater. This is the theater today. You still see the stairs, and this fountain area is here. And this is very good for science, strangely enough, because here's the volcanic deposits, the volcanic ash from 1902. Most of it is gone. It's rushed into the sea. But because of this area behind the theater, some of it was laid down and is still there. So we can actually go as volcanologists and study the deposit, one of the very rare places we can do that. And here we see the tiles, the roof tiles at the very bottom, and here's a person for scale. This is the same outcrop. And here's the first layer of deposits. This is the May 8th, 1902 deposit, and this is from later in the summer of the same year. So the roof tiles came out first because of the blast, and then the ash was deposited on top. So here's just a slightly more enlarged image of the same, and you see the fine ash with some larger stones, and this was the material that would have been all over the city, filling every little inch of square inch, every little cubic inch of the air in the city, and everybody would have been affected by this. So after May 8th, what happened? Well, following May 8th, another plume rises, and the volcano has more of those glowing avalanches, these nuer dance or pyroclastic flows. There's another one May 19th, May 20th, June 6th, July 9th, and August 30th. So the volcano was going on for quite a while. The latter flow also destroys the village of Montrouge, causing another 1,000 casualties, which brings the total number of casualties to 30,000 people, approximately. There is, of course, a bit of uncertainty here, but it's approximately 30,000 people that have died in the events of that year in Saint-Pierre and surroundings. So, then here an impression of the city. As you can see, it almost looks like a World War II site, and the volcano being up there. And clearing of the ruins was, of course, a major task, and it was a big blow, it was a big shock, and the clearing of the ruins started to progress in the weeks after the eruption, but it was really slow. And it was so slow that the ruins actually became a tourist attraction. And Saint-Pierre never fully recovered from the events of 1902. At the moment, the population is about 7,000, and this is only about a third of the population of 1902. So here's a few impressions of clearing out, and here a French inspection team. Here you see some of the people trying to clear out the rubble, but eventually it proved to be such a burden, such a task, that the ruins became a tourist attraction. People started to pose for photographs instead of clearing out the rubble. And if you go there today, this is how it looks. It's eerie, but also strangely beautiful. And here you see some of the warehouses near the coast, and some of the ruins are, strangely attractive, I find, personally at least, and you can have wonderful walks there. And it makes you think a little bit about, time, the scale of human endeavor, and nature in general. So, but then the Great Spine happened. When I was a student, I read about the Great Spine. I thought it was the Great Spine that did all the damage, but not so. The Great Spine came afterwards. It was only during the summer of that year, 1902, and later into autumn that the Great Spine grew. This is one of the rare photos of the spine being pushed out. I made this analogy about the toothpaste earlier. So imagine hardened toothpaste and you push this out. This is kind of how the Great Spine would have behaved. So initially it would have been solid, but because of pressure underneath, it was coming out as a solid lump of hot material being pushed up into the air. Eventually it grew several hundred meters tall. So this is the Great Spine, and there is a person here in white uniform. Can you see that person here? Maybe not, but it gives you a sense. The spine reached 350 meters. It crumbles, however, in early 1903. So the lifetime of this spine was very short-lived, and it's almost completely gone in March of 1903. Small-scale dome growth and minor pyroclastic flows actually continue for another 2 years. So the volcano is calming down, but it takes some time. And then the big spine is visible here, and it's considered by the French elite that this is Montpellier, really showing the victory over civilization. So here you see the spine over the devastated city, and this is one of the few photographs in these few months when the spine was standing. And yes, it is quite a sight. It's towering over the city. And an observatory is established because obviously there was realization this is problematic, and this was established in 1904, but it's dismounted again in 1926, just before the volcano starts again in 1929. While this sounds a bit, wrong in a way, we also have to realize volcanoes operate on very different timescales to humans. And therefore, I don't blame the people there. After 20 years of no activity, you question what you're doing there. But volcanoes don't operate on generation timescales as we perceive it. And that's a bitter lesson that we have learned there. So, what went wrong in Saint-Pierre? Well, if we take a deep breath, a lot of volcanologists blame the French authorities, and I like to personally take a step back here and say, I don't think that people understood the severity of the problem at the time. They had, of course, a lot of other interests, and maybe that election thing was a bit unpleasant. It shouldn't have been a major reason for people being held back from evacuation. But I should also point out, people had no place to go. There was no facilities. There was no plans. There was no evacuation plans. Even if the authorities would have said, we must leave, people probably would have died in hundreds during accidents during the evacuation. So there was no preparation for this. Of course, there was obvious warning signs, and nowadays we would say, oh dear, you can't, stay there. But back then, these were not necessarily linked in people's minds, and this was, of course, something that we just had to learn the hard way. And people didn't really know better. That's where I come from. And it was far beyond their grasp. I don't know whether you heard about this, but I'm not a specialist. I'm not very good with zoology, but apparently there's no black swans in Europe, but there's black swans in Australia. And there was a saying in Britain that there is no such thing as a black swan until they discovered Australia. And indeed, we call events that are completely not understandable, that we have not perceived in any way, we call them today black swan events, something that we couldn't even imagine. And not only the CIA and MI5 and whoever else has actual teams that thinks about black swan events, scientists do that too. They think about what could conceivably happen if this or that comes together. I know the US GS has teams that think about if at Mount St. Helens it would not have been a Sunday, if it would have been on a Tuesday, if it would have been on this and that, how would this have unfolded? Could it have actually been improved? Could it be worse? What is the variations on that? And that is the concept of black swan events. So we can play with this situation and we can work with this and learn from this. And this, if you ask me, was, for our understanding, it was a black swan event back then. So I have a few minutes left, so I'll talk about some rocks, one of my favorite topics. When I was up there in 2002, I went to the rocks, the dome rock of 1902, and I picked up this rather uncharismatic lump of rock. I cut it open in the lab, and it looked a little better then. So here's the scale, 1 centimeter, and I picked it up because of these dark lumps. This is the rock inside the volcano. This is what we call andesite or dacite, depending on the exact mineral composition, but it has these dark blobs in there, and this is basalt. This material here has a silica content of about 60%, and this much lower, about 45 to 50%. This is what comes from deep inside the earth, and this is what volcanoes make up when they cook material inside. So, and these kind of rocks, they have tiny little crystals, feldspar crystals in this case, and I was so curious, I took the microscope and looked at some of these crystals, and crystals grow like, well, in layers, like trees that develop rings. So you can look at crystals and you can see how they grew. And this is one of the crystals from the 1902 dome. And you see that it's nicely sewn. This is like tree rings here. But see that end here? There's something a little wrong. And we call this a sieve-textured area here. And then it's nicely overgrown. And then something bad happened to this crystal. So I zoomed in with my microscope, and here you can see that there was something eating into this crystal layer. This is this area here, and this means this crystal had a really bad time. It was growing quite happily, and suddenly something started to digest this crystal. And this is something that means fresh magma that was a lot hotter came into the volcano. And we can see that in the crystal record, and it must have been these blobs of basaltic material. So this tells us a lot about how such an eruption started. Initially, we have a magma system inside the volcano, and we bring new magma. We replenish the system with fresh basaltic magma from depth. This brings not only new volume, it also starts to heat up the resident magma. This will cause all sorts of processes inside the volcano, and gas overpressure will be a result because the new magma brings more gas. And this is a process that will take years. But here is that little illustration. We have magma sitting in the volcano. It's sitting there quite happily and cooling, and it doesn't do very much. But once we bring new fresh magma with a lot of gas in, we start to invigorate this system. And after some time, this will cause an overpressure, and the volcano will blow its top. Because of this, we know that volcanoes will start to have unrest weeks, months, years before the eruption. It takes time. And there was indications at Pelée, but people didn't understand this phenomenon. So here is something, a little interview I gave for Swedish radio, and for those who read Swedish, you can translate this. It says, big volcanoes are nervous before they erupt. And that's exactly what it is. Volcanoes show unrest, and depending on the size of a volcano, this can be from months to years. And for the giant volcanoes like Yellowstone, this is likely even hundreds of years. So we would understand these days if a volcano is gearing up to an eruption. And La Palma, many people say, oh, it was so rapidly. It's not entirely true. The actual magma movement happened a week before, but the first unrest signals of the volcano, it was actually years before. there was earthquake swarms in 2013, 2017, etc. The scientists knew that La Palma is gearing up to an eruption. This is why they were ready in the week before the eruption. So, what do we do today? Just a few words at the end. Well, if a volcano is monitored continuously, and that is what we do today, then we know what is background fluctuations and what is increased unrest. And here we have teams of scientists that can give alarm if a number of changes occur, if we have seismic activity, if we have expansion of the flank of a volcano, if there is increased gas emission, increased heat flow, all of these signals are put together and it allows scientists to say something. So we study volcanoes long term today. We compare appropriately, or we hope it's appropriate at least, appropriate comparison for Mont Pelée would have been Merapi, Unsen in Japan, Soufriere Hills, and that helps us to understand these systems better. And of course, Mont Pelée has a second observatory now, and that's active, and they're doing a great job right now. So multi-technique approaches are currently used on a permanent basis, and this allows us to really make very accurate predictions. And the second eruption of Mount St. Helens in 1982, it was predicted to within 4 hours of it occurring. Can you believe that? So we've come a long way, but we also had to pay a high price. Thank you very much.